Thank you. I guess what we can all agree about is that we're in trouble. Humans have not been evolving for thousands of years so that we lock ourselves in our home. So something somewhere we can all agree has gone wrong. But what we've heard about so far are the systemic consequences of this trouble. The potential, it has been suggested, for the radical reconfiguration of global relationships. And maybe after this crisis, global relationships will be reconfigured, but maybe they won't. So my aim is rather more modest and small scale. I want to ask, what does this crisis tell us about how people learn to be citizens? And I want to make three preliminary observations. And the first might not seem obvious, and that is, it's not easy to be a citizen. It's pretty easy to be a consumer. You just need a certain amount of money in your pocket. You go to the market and you sort of let your belly do the talking. It's quite easy to be an audience, particularly for the mass media. You sit back and you wait for the kind of cultural incontinence to come towards you. But it's not easy to be a citizen. I mean, most of us don't have a lot of time in the day when we sit down and think, how am I going to coexist with other citizens? People I don't know, people I possibly will never really even be able to understand, and I might not like, but I have to live with them. The language of citizenship, the language of politics and democracy in particular, is very often opaque, it's confusing, it's time consuming, and it is no surprise a lot of people disengage from it. So the first thing that we can say is, whatever we want to say about learning to be citizens, it's hard work, not easy work. The second thing to say is that civic practices, like any other form of social behavior, are learned. I mean, they're not natural. And sometimes you have to learn them really quickly. So for example, if you would have asked me at the beginning of this year what social distancing is, it would have been an unknown concept to me. I mean, I can think of a number of people I quite have liked to have social distance from at the time if I'd have known what the concept meant, but I didn't. And you learn. And as time goes on, it becomes technical learning. How many meters is social distancing? What do I have to do if I'm in a supermarket? What do I have to do if I'm walking down the street and I see someone? We learn these things. And the way in which we learn them is cultural. They're not obvious. They're not natural. They're learned, and they are also taught through a process of socialization. And the third preliminary observation I want to make is that there is more than one way of performing citizenship at any one time. For example, you think of voters. I wrote a book called How Voters Feel, about the most mundane aspect of democracy, voting. And there were some people who told me, I love voting. There are other people who told me, I don't even know what voting is. I interviewed an 18-year-old woman with 2 children, and she didn't know what the concept meant. Voting, demonstrating, rioting, these are all forms of citizenship. You can perform them in different ways. Now, what I want to ask is how our traditionally rather thin and impoverished ties of citizenship might be strengthened or might be weakened as a result of the current pandemic. So let me make some observations about the current situation. The first is that, contrary to beliefs that it is incompatible with modernity, life has actually slowed down. I mean, everyone has said, sociologists to everyday people sitting on a bus, that everything's speeding up, and life has actually slowed down. We have been able to slow it down. and we are learning habits of tranquility and domestic security that were not obvious to us, and that perhaps some of us have started to forget. Interesting ones, which may suggest something about the slowing down of our civic life, the slowing down of the rush to judgment. The second thing is that whilst life has slowed down, nature moves quickly, and too quickly for us to comprehend. So we have a classical case of what we call desynchronization between the human cognitive and emotional capacity to cope with the changing world and the change. You know, the pandemic actually has traumatized a lot of people, and a lot of the mental health problems are not just to do with loneliness, they're to do with the shock of something having happened so quickly. And this raises important questions about what we have traditionally thought of as epistemic duality, the Coleman argument, the fast thinking, slow thinking argument, about whether we think fast and when we should think fast, and when do we think slow. And Kahneman and Tversky have written a fascinating book about the contrast between these two levels of thinking. And it seems that although we have got very used to fast thinking, slow thinking is sometimes really necessary when confronted with new and complex problems. The third observation I want to make about the current situation is that norms of recognition are being recast. That is to say, you think of the clapping in this country, Britain, for the National Health Service, for healthcare workers across the world. This is a different kind of recognition from the recognition that we had grown used to over a long time. And it is connected with practices of autonomous collective improvisation and empathetic solidarity that are emerging. So I have some practical questions, and I think they really are practical questions, and they're questions that we're thinking about very seriously at the moment in my university and amongst my research groups. First of all, and I ask you to consider these questions. First of all, can forms of democratic self-determination be sustained and built upon in the post-pandemic world? I mean, to translate, are we all being very, very nice to each other when we are all fearing for our lives, and then we stop fearing for our lives and we act like a lot of shits? So the question is there a sustainability to this new kind of self-determined solidarity? The second question, I think, is a really important question. How can we creatively evaluate global examples of new civic practice? How do we create what I would call an inventory of innovative democratic practices? I mean, all of you will know we have what's called the FTSE every day. We have the Dow Jones Index. It measures a certain kind of productivity, or at least a euphemism for productivity. But we don't have that in terms of democratic citizenship. We have nothing that measures very well how well we are doing, and particularly in terms of innovative behavior. And my third question that I would like you to take on board is, how do we learn the habits of collective civic creativity? How do we turn citizenship from that kind of terrible civics education that goes on in schools all over the world, which is a lot to do with saluting the flag and learning which parliamentary house has which powers, and how do we move that into a process of civic unlearning, where we throw away some of those rather impoverished ideas of citizenship and we move towards creative ideas? So I want to conclude with some suggested answers of my own. One, this is not the end of the crisis. The crisis after this crisis may well be worse than the one we have now. And that, of course, is going to be the economic crisis, when possibly a quarter of the world's economy will have collapsed by the time we come out of this pandemic. We're moving into a period of recession. A recession is a growth under 2%, where we might be going to minus 25%. We're around about minus 8% in the financial crash at the beginning of this century. So how do we avoid closing down imaginative responses? And my answer is, we need imaginative, slower thinking politics that enable us to deliberate about the options before us in this totally new economic territory that we are about to enter. Second answer that I offer, I think we have to encourage considered pro-social civic practices by providing people with what I would call semiotic resources. So the clapping that has taken place, I don't regard as incidental or trite. I think it's actually a new civic ritual and an important one. Because what's really going on here, I think, is a celebration of human caring. A form of celebration of caring that was downgraded in the period of the mean world economy that only ever celebrated profit. Something semiotically is changing in terms of the resources we have available to articulate our humanity. And the importance of those semiotic resources cannot be understated. I think back to the opening ceremony of the London Olympics, when eccentrically, against all of the traditions of opening ceremonies, what was celebrated were people lying in beds being looked after by nurses in the National Health Service in Britain. And what was said was, if you want to know why this country is great, that's why it's great. It's not its army, it's not because it conquered large parts of the world, it's because it looks after people without charging them money for it. So I want to conclude by saying, I don't think any of us have all the answers, but I think what we have are imaginative capacities. And those imaginative capacities have got to be protected, both during this period of fear and after it's over, when we return to what is rather horribly referred to as normality.